Okay, good afternoon. Today's lecture will be on طيب صالح's novel Season of Migration to the North. بالعربي موسم الهجرة إلى الشمال. Okay, طيب صالح was born in 1929 in الشمالية province in the Sudan. He is of an Arab, Nubian, and Negro ethnic ascendancy, Arab African. Died in London in 2009. Saleh attended universities in Khartoum and in London. He worked for BBC Arabic Service. The novel, Season of Migration to the North, usually referred to as Mawsim, was published in 1966 and translated into English, what you will be reading this week, in 1969. It is a prose poem that deals with the conflicts of modern Africa, such as traditionalism versus modernism, rural versus urban, men versus women, and the village, the specific versus the universal. He's not a very prolific writer. He wrote only a few short stories. One of them is Ars Zain, The Wedding of Zain, and other short stories in 1969. Now, I thought the best way to introduce you to the novel is to read to you excerpts from a lecture that Tayyip Saleh gave at AUB way before you were born in 1980. Okay, on May 19, 1980, Tayyip Saleh gave a lecture at AUB on his novel. The following are excerpts from the transcription of the recorded lecture, which was published in the casebook by late Professor Muna Amyouni. Beginning of quote, "I have never before addressed such an enormous crowd. I don't really know whether a writer can say anything about his work, above and beyond what he has already said. I started Season in the summer of 1960, when on a holiday in a little village in Cannes, it's in the south of France. I got stuck before Mustafa Said started his confession. I fell under the influence of Freud, what you read at the beginning of the term, and read more than once Civilization and its Discontents. You will find out that Mustafa Said represents the Freudian man. But above everything else, the foundation of my work, for what it is worth, lies in what I am, a Sudanese Muslim Arab who was born at a certain time in a certain place. I believe that if I have contributed anything to modern Arabic literature, it is my constant plea for toleration. One of the major themes of Season is the East-West confrontation, or to be more specific, the confrontation between the Arab Muslim world and the Western European one. He says, "I created, therefore, a conflicting world in which nothing is certain, and formalistically, two voices to force the reader to make up his or her mind." We have already discussed the East-West, Orient-Occident, self-other relationship in Edward Said. According to Edward Said, Orientalism tries to show that European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and underground self. He says Europe was always in a position of strength, not to say domination. So according to Edward Said, Orientalism promoted the difference between the West, the self, and the Orient, the other, and deepened the distinction, reiterating Western superiority over Oriental backwardness. We will encounter the same vision of polarization, tension, and division between the East and the West, the South and the North, specifically the Sudan and Imperial England in Season of Migration to the North. The two voices in the novel, already mentioned before, are those of the narrator, Al-Rawi, and Mustafa Said. Critics and readers have different views on the representative figure and main voice in the novel. Is it the anonymous narrator, or is it Mustafa Said? It's up to you to decide in class discussion. Both stand for two Sudanese who lived and studied in England, but their relationship with the West, with the North, is quite dissimilar. The narrator considers the coming of the British was neither a tragedy nor yet a blessing. Mustafa Said has a relationship of defiance with the West. He poisons his life trying to avenge the defeat of the Sudanese, the colonization of the East, engages in sexual relationships with English women, and kills one of them. 3 commit suicide, possibly because of him. Sheila Greenwood, who worked as a waitress in a restaurant, Isabella Seymour, wife of a successful surgeon and mother of 2 daughters and a son, and Anne Hammond, who is a university student. Joan Morris is the 4th woman. It's the woman he falls in love with, marries, and kills with a sharp blade on a cold February evening. Now, I will discuss the colonial context because the novel cannot be understood outside this context. It was in September 1898 that the forces of imperialism, the British Army led by Kitchener, invaded the Sudan. Muhammad Ahmad, a religious leader who challenged the power of British occupation of Egypt and was able to end Egyptian rule in the Sudan in the 1880s. He drew his inspiration from Sufism, what you studied in 202. He was able to create a state based upon Islam and modeled upon the community of the Prophet and his companions, Sahaba. After his death, the Khalifa carried on the state, which was ended by British occupation in 1898. The reforming and foreign governments felt the fear of such religious movements and attempted to oppose or control them. It was at Durman, this is the name of the city, the town in Sudan, on the banks of the Nile, that witnessed the East-West, South-North confrontation. The battle was between Sudanese desert tribesmen, who numbered around 52,000, against the military might of the biggest empire, and Kitchener's men numbered around 20,000. The Sudanese had only swords, spears, and the British had guns and rifles. The battle was over in 5 hours, and Kitchener remarked arrogantly, the enemy had been given a good dusting. In the novel, Kitchener says to Mahmoud Wad Ahmad, after his defeat at the Battle of Atbara, "Why have you come to my country to lay waste and plunder?" It was the intruder who said this to the person whose land it was, and the owner of the land bowed his head and said nothing. Mustafa Said resumes the Battle of Durman, but more than 3 decades later, with the same spears and swords, the victims being British women rather than the British Army. He says, "I resumed the war with bow and sword, and spear and arrows. The city was transformed into an extraordinary woman, and with her symbols and her mysterious calls, towards whom I drove my camels." Now, I will discuss briefly the post-colonial discourse and the impact of the West during the Nahda period in the Arab world. The contact between the Arab world and the Western one during the Nahda signaled the beginning of a debate between traditionalism and modernism. The term Nahda, for those who don't know, literally means awakening, or if you wish, Renaissance. It covers the period from mid or late 19th century till the present. During this period, the impact of the West became a major factor in Arab social and political life. Europe was seen as the modern self vis-à-vis the different, non-modern other. With the expanding power of Europe, the question to be answered was the following, of course, in the Arab world. How could Arab Muslims acquire the strength to confront Europe and become part of the modern world? The Arab awakening can be seen as a struggle between two standpoints. The first adhered to Islam as the source of legitimacy. The second took the West as a model to aspire to. Many regarded modernity as uniquely and strictly a European phenomena, Western Europe, of course. The most prominent representative of the Islamic modernists or reformers are Rafa' al-Tahtawi, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, and Muhammad Abdu, who were opposed to Western domination but appreciated the Western scientific and cultural achievements. They realized that living in the modern world requires certain changes, which could be carried out while Muslims remain true to themselves and to their identity. In conclusion, the religious reformers aimed at the following: tried to reconcile tradition and modernity, hoping that the Muslim world can overcome the challenges it was facing since the time of Napoleon, 1798. They stressed the need to return to the original sources of Islam. Another voice is that of Taha Hussein, a famous novelist and prominent literary critic who took the second position. The West should be taken as a model to imitate. He asserted that we must follow the West, the path of the Europeans, as to be their equals and partners in civilization, in its good and evil, its sweetness and bitterness, what can be loved or hated, what can be praised or blamed. Now, I will discuss the first voice, that of a Rawi, who remains without a name till the very end of your novel. The narrator. He was a storm-swept feather, ريشة في مهب الريح, in the north, in England. That is, he was the other in England. But again, he was a storm-swept feather in the south, in the Sudan. In his own country, he was the other. The first page of Season announces the return of the narrator, Lauda, to his people after an absence of 7 years in England, where he received a doctorate degree in English literature. He rejoices leaving the coldness of England and returning to the warmth of his people in a small village at the bend of the Nile. He returns with great yearning, al-hanin. Anyone who lived abroad probably has experienced this feeling, and feels a sense of stability. He says, I felt not like a storm-swept feather, but like the palm tree, a being with a background, with roots, with a purpose. These feelings are reassured every time he visits his grandfather, Haj Ahmad, who's around 88 years. He reveals a desire to seek roots in the village and to re-engage himself in his society and culture. The grandfather, Haj Ahmad, stands for the traditional, immutable man who has the secret of life, and it is to live simply and die simply. عدم الإسراف في الحياة. A simple and traditional life that both the narrator and Mustafa Saeed were not able to lead. Contrary to Mustafa, the narrator considers the North is very much like the South. This is an important page in your novel. He says, over there is like here, neither better nor worse. But I am from here, just as the date palm standing in the courtyard of our house has grown in our house and not in anyone else's. The fact that they, i.e. the British, came to our land, I know not why. Does that mean that we should poison our present and our future? Sooner or later, they will leave our country. The railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools will be ours. After spending some time in his village, the narrator goes to Khartoum to teach pre-Islamic Arabic poetry at a secondary school. He feels that life is good for him and the world remains the same. Yet the narrator has not remained the same. Contrary to his affirmation that, he says, I too had lived with them, but I had lived with them superficially, neither loving nor hating them. According to the narrator, imperialism and the coming of the British was neither a tragedy nor yet a blessing. This view differs radically from that of Mustafa Said, as we shall see later. He idealizes his country and his people, only to realize that things have changed and the world has turned upside down. No sooner does he find that the love he wants to flow from his heart has turned into rage and anger. Mustafa Said disappears one day. We're not sure by drowning or suicide, but more possibly suicide, and leaves his wife Husna and the two boys in the care of the narrator. He becomes their guardian. The narrator falls in love with Husna bint Mahmoud, yet he does nothing. He does not let love flow from his heart, as he claims at the beginning of season. I want to give lavishly, this is what he says at the very beginning. I want love to flow from my heart, to ripen and bear fruit. Now, there are two reasons for the alienation of the narrator in his own country and among his own people. So now we will discuss not the South-North conflict, but rather the Arab-Arab conflict, the South-South conflict. The two reasons for the narrator's alienation are, one, you should be familiar with the word, patriarchy, from Simone de Beauvoir. Patriarchy means a male-dominated society by the father or the patriarch, with capital P. And tragedy, two, neocolonialism, the corruption of the new rulers of Africa. I will start by discussing patriarchy. Wad Rayes, a 70-year-old man, much married and much divorced, wants to marry Husna, who is very decisive when she says she will go to no man and threatens to kill him and kill herself if they force her to marry him. In that small village at the bend of the Nile, we see the same duality between the self and the other that Simone de Beauvoir refers to in The Second Sex. A woman, she says, is simply what man decrees. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject with capital S. He is the absolute. She is the other. Wad Rayes argues that men are guardians of women and that she will marry him whether she likes it or not. He says that God said in his noble book that النساء والبنون زينة الحياة, which is totally inaccurate, only to be corrected by the narrator who recites the verse as it stands in the Quran. It is wealth and children, al-mal wal-banun, are the adornment of life. But then again, he changes it to justify marrying so many women. Okay. Now she is forced to marry Wad Rayes, and after a few days later, she kills him and kills herself. Mabruka, Wad Rayes's first wife, and the narrator are the only two people in the village who do not curse Husna. However, the reasons for that are quite different. The narrator confesses that Husna bint Mahmoud was the only woman he had loved. Haj Ahmad prays to God to rest the soul of Wad Rayes, curses all women whom he considers ikhwat al-shaytan, sisters of the devil. The second reason for his alienation is neocolonialism and the corruption of the new rulers of Africa. The alienation of the narrator multiplies. He attends a conference of the Ministry of Education to discuss ways to unify the educational methods. The conference is held in the Independence Hall. Notice the name of the hall, Independence. In a hotel in Khartoum. The hall was designed in London, the marble flown from Italy. The minsters are dressed in silk, mohair, and cashmere. The cost of the hall is around £1 million. And the wealth of the minsters of Africa stand in sharp contrast to the poverty of the Sudanese, who lack schools and who lack hospitals. The minister in his speech considers the bourgeoisie as more dangerous to the future of Africa than imperialism. It is the same minister who leads a very bourgeois life. He is known to be corrupt and has amassed a fortune from the sweat of the poor, wretched, half-naked people in the jungle. The narrator starts considering going back to the north. He says, "There is no room for me here." He says it more than once. "Why don't I pack up and go?" The migration that appears in the title of the book involves not only geographic migration from the Sudan to England, but also the internal migration of the narrator, who starts feeling the coldness rather than the warmth of his people. Twice in the novel does the narrator say there is no justice or moderation in the world. The first time he says this statement is after attending the conference in Khartoum. And the second time he says it is when he describes the courtroom scene in London, where Isabella Seymour's husband stands to defend his wife in spite of the fact that she told him that she had a relationship with Mustafa. He says he feels no bitterness towards her and expresses his deep sadness at losing her. The narrator feels bitterness and hatred. The unfaithful wife is being defended by her husband, while the faithful Husna suffers a tragic fate in that small patriarchal village at the bend of the Nile. He says, "I feel bitterness and hatred, for after all those victims, he crowned his life with yet another one, Husna bint Mahmoud, the only woman I have ever loved." Now I will discuss the second voice in the novel, that of Mustafa Said. Mustafa Said is the second voice in season. We can notice the dissimilarity with the narrator from the very first pages. It is when he starts his confessions, this is where Tayyib Saleh got stuck. This is on page 19, and this is where he read Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Mustafa Said was born in Khartoum, notice the date, 1898. It's the same year of the Battle of Omdurman. He decides to avenge the colonization of the Sudan, but under his own terms. He conceives his relationship with the English woman as a battle, inflicting pain and suffering on them and treating his victims as Kitchener treated his native people. As a child, he was raised by his mother His father died before he was born, and he lives with her like strangers, and they act as relatives to each other. He is described as isolated, arrogant. His mind is like a sharp knife, but his heart is as cold as a piece of ice. Nothing in the world could shake him. He pursues his education first at a local school in the Sudan, then attends a British school in Cairo, and then leaves to London, where he receives a doctorate degree in economics from the University of London. He says, "The mysterious call led me to the coast of Dover, to London, and tragedy." He says it again more than once. He lives in England for 30 years, but is insensitive to its beauty, and he enjoys nothing. Mustafa is concerned only with his campaign of inflicting pain and suffering upon the English woman. He uses terms of Arab military campaigns every time he goes out to find a new victim. He says, "By day, I lived with the theories of Keynes and Tony, and at night, I resumed the war with bow and sword, with spear and arrows. I saw the troops returning filled with terrors." He saddles his camels, refers to the Arab army conquering Spain in the 8th century, and claims, which is not true, that one of his forefathers was a soldier in Tariq bin Ziyad's army. The connection in Mustafa Said's mind between sexual conquest and his war on British colonialism is very evident. The description of his sexual campaigns are similar to a description of a military conquest. He says, "Yes, my dear sirs, I came as an invader into your very homes, a drop of the poison which you have injected into the veins of history." He hears the rattle of swords and the clatter of hooves of Allenby's horses in Jerusalem in 1919. Now, I will discuss now few levels of the character of Mustafa Said. The first level is the Freudian one. Mustafa Said represents on one level a man divided between Eros and Thanatos. The death instinct is both directed inward towards himself and outward towards his woman victims. He confesses in the courtroom that he killed Jane Morris, and he killed her intentionally, as if he wants to die in the North. They sentence him to imprisonment of 7 years. The distant call still rings in his ears. He says, "It's futile to deceive oneself. That distant call still rings in my ears. I thought that my life and marriage here would silence it." As for Jane Morris, he marries her after pursuing her for 3 years. He knows that she's a woman who abstains from nothing, cheating, lying, or stealing. He knows that she is being unfaithful to him and often asks himself what it was that bound him to her. The natural reaction is for him to leave her. Instead, he obeys the pleasure principle, decides to stay with her, completely controlled by his id, given in to his desires. His love to her is described as the icy battlefield from which he would not make a safe return. He is the sailor, and she is the shore of destruction. I was in torment, and in a way I could not understand, I derived pleasure from my suffering. Now I will discuss the South-North dichotomy in Mustafa Said. Mustafa Said's relationship with the West is one of defiance and yearning. There are many times in the novel where Mustafa Said says that he is South that yearns for the North and the ice. But it is the same North that he is waging war against. His apartment in London is full of Persian rugs with the smell of incense and Eastern perfumes. The narrator, visiting the secret room of Mustafa Saeed in the village, describes it as a graveyard, as a joke. It is packed with English books and not a single Arabic book. It has a fireplace. Who needs a fireplace in the Sudan? And 2 Victorian chairs. The room resembles an English apartment planted in a totally different cultural space, that is the Sudanese village. While his apartment in London has the oriental grandeur and lustful odors. His love to Jane Morris unfolds the same dichotomy: love, defiance, and hatred. After putting the blade edge between her breasts, he confesses his love to her. It was the night of truth, the night of tragedy. Mustafa Saeed, on the 3rd level, is both conqueror and conquered. I have come to you as a conqueror, are his words every time a new victim falls for him. The narrator describes it as a melodramatic phrase, unable to forget that he is at the same time the Arab African. He tells Isabella Seymour that I seek not glory, for the likes of me do not seek glory. The 2 halves of Mustafa represent the Sudanese traditional man and the modern London intellectual, the economist and university professor and lecturer. Nowhere does he emerge in the novel as fully traditional or fully modern. He is not the truly modern individual, nor a genuinely traditional one, probably because of the impact of 2 forces on him: his past identity and his Western education. In the secret room, the narrator finds an unwritten biography of Mustafa Saeed with 1-line dedication. Opening a notebook, I read on the 1st page, my life story. On the 2nd was the dedication: to those who see with 1 eye, speak with 1 tongue, and see things as either black or white, either Eastern or Western. This dedication limits any possibility of the encounter between the East and the West. One interpretation, again, feel free to have your own interpretation, is that his life story is dedicated, perhaps, to those who see the coming of the British as a blessing, a civilizing mission, as Richard, an English economist, who affirms that the Arabs cannot manage to live without the British. The narrator speaks of the railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools that will be ours soon. What Mustafa Saeed establishes is a different view. He says, the ships sailing down the Nile were carrying guns, not bread. And the railways were set up to transport troops. And the schools were started to teach the Sudanese how to say yes in English. You can connect it to the cultural domination in Edward Said. Okay. It could as well be read as a dedication to a being who sees things as entirely Eastern or entirely Western, who is not both traditional and modern, someone without a divided self like Mustafa Said. Lastly, I will discuss the contradictory selves of Mustafa Said. There are many contradictory selves. Mustafa lives and becomes a lie. He is Hassan, Charles, Amin, Mustafa, and Richard. When Isabella Seymour asks him about his race, he answers, I'm like Othello, Arab African. Addresses the jury and prosecutors in the courtroom saying, I am no Othello. So he's both Othello and no Othello. I am a lie. Why don't you sentence me to be hanged and so kill the lie? Who knows who is Othello? Okay. Yeah. Briefly. It's a poem, but go ahead.
Okay, so Othello is a main character in Shakespeare's play. He is described as an eloquent and powerful character, and he becomes a commander of the Venetian Republic. However, his insecurities in his race and origin lead to his downfall. He was black, and he was a Moor, which is in Islamic Maghreb in the Middle Ages, and this led to his deception. And due to his insecurities, he ended up killing his wife, which was his polar opposite, was a beautiful white woman, and killing himself eventually.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Othello, of course, it's a play by Shakespeare, a tragedy, is the Moor of Venice. Moors, Berber of North Africa. The tragic man, a hero with a flaw, following his instincts and irrational desires, believes that his loyal wife, Desdemona, is a whore on the slightest of evidence. He smothers her face with a pillow on their marriage bed. He says, "Speak of me as I am. Then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well." These were Othello's last words before stabbing himself. Now, the conclusion. At the end of the novel, we find the narrator trapped halfway in the river between south and north. And for the first time in his life, he takes a decision. He was described as a very passive man in the novel. The decision to stay in the Sudan. All my life, I had not chosen, had not decided. Now I'm taking a decision. I choose life. I, like a comic actor shouting on a stage, I screamed with all my remaining strength, "Help, help." Now, again, try to have your own interpretation if it is a pessimistic or an optimistic end, or if it is both at the same time. As for Mustafa Saeed, if his intellect and knowledge were used to develop the Sudan, which contributed to the betterment of his own people, if his struggle to avenge the Sudanese, then his struggle to avenge the Sudanese would have led him to the Sudan and not to Victoria Station and tragedy. Like Othello, he loved his country too well, but not wisely. Thank you.